The tragic life of Danny Trejo, from battling addiction before most kids even enter their teenage years, to standing trial at just 16, from the pain of failed marriages and struggling to bond with his children, to the loneliness that fame and fortune couldn't cure. Danny Trejo's life has been a roller coaster of hardship, survival, and unexpected triumphs. He grew up with hunger as a daily reality, only to later taste wealth and recognition yet still wrestle with emptiness inside. He lived as a hardened criminal in real life, before becoming one of Hollywood's most iconic tough guys on screen. And just when he thought he had conquered his demons, he had to watch his own son face the same battles with addiction. This is the story of Danny Trejo, a life that is as heartbreaking as it is inspiring. A story that reminds us that behind the spotlight, success doesn't always mean peace. Born on May 16, 1944, in the Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, Danny Trejo entered a world that seemed designed to break him before he could walk. His childhood unfolded in the shadow of addiction, violence, and systemic poverty, a landscape where survival meant learning to fight before learning to read. His father, Dan Trejo Sr., struggled with alcoholism and periods of unemployment that left the family teetering on the edge of destitution. His mother, Alice Rivera, worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, often leaving young Danny to navigate the dangerous streets alone. The neighborhood itself was a battleground. Echo Park in the 1950s was controlled by rival gangs, drug dealers, and those who had given up hope of legitimate escape. Unlike the middle-class stability that shaped actors like Joe Pesci or Mick Jagger's academic opportunities, Trejo's formative years were spent learning the unforgiving mathematics of street survival. By age 12, he was already using drugs, marijuana at first, then harder substances that promised temporary escape from a reality too harsh to bear sober. School became irrelevant early. Teachers saw a troubled kid with facial scars and gang affiliations. They couldn't see the sharp intelligence and desperate hunger for acceptance that drove his increasingly destructive behavior. Trejo later reflected, "I wasn't born bad, but I was born into badness. Every day was about proving you belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was hell." His teenage years blurred together in a haze of petty crime, drug use, and escalating violence. Unlike other future stars who might rebel against parental expectations, Trejo had no stable expectations to rebel against. His family was fighting for basic survival, and he quickly learned that the streets offered their own brutal form of education. By 16, he was a hardened criminal, his face already bearing the scars that would later make him instantly recognizable to movie audiences worldwide. In 1968, at age 24, Danny Trejo was sentenced to San Quentin State Prison for drug trafficking and armed robbery, crimes that represented the inevitable conclusion of a young life lived without guidance or hope. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. For Trejo, it became the beginning of an unlikely transformation that would take decades to complete. San Quentin, in the late 1960s, was among America's most violent prisons, a place where survival required constant vigilance and the ability to project strength even when feeling broken inside. Trejo's imposing physical presence, his muscular build, distinctive facial scars, and unflinching stare made him a natural candidate for the prison's power structure. He could have easily become a career criminal, spending his remaining years cycling in and out of the system. Instead, something unexpected happened. In the prison's makeshift drug rehabilitation program, Trejo encountered counselors who saw past his intimidating exterior to recognize the intelligence and pain underneath. For the first time in his life, adults treated him as someone worth saving rather than someone to be feared or discarded. The experience was transformative but also deeply unsettling. It forced him to confront the reality that much of his life had been wasted on pursuits that brought only temporary satisfaction and lasting regret. The road to sobriety was neither quick nor easy. Trejo experienced multiple relapses, moments of despair where the old patterns seemed impossible to break. Fellow inmates who had known him as a violent enforcer watched in bewilderment as he struggled to find new ways of being in the world. Some were supportive, others were suspicious of what they saw as weakness. But gradually, with the help of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and a growing network of people who believed in his potential for change, Trejo began to envision a life beyond crime and addiction. His release from prison in 1969 marked not the end of his struggles, but their true beginning. The outside world had little use for an ex-convict whose only marketable skills involved intimidation and violence. Jobs were scarce, opportunities even scarcer. The temptation to return to familiar patterns was constant and overwhelming. The The 1970s and early 1980s were perhaps the most difficult years of Danny Trejo's life. Harder in many ways than his time in prison, because freedom brought responsibilities and choices that incarceration had eliminated. He worked construction jobs when he could find them, collected unemployment when he couldn't, and fought daily against the addiction that threatened to reclaim him. During this period, Trejo became deeply involved in drug counseling, volunteering at rehabilitation centers, and sharing his story with others struggling with addiction. The work was emotionally draining but also profoundly meaningful. For the first time, his painful experiences served a constructive purpose. Former gang members and addicts saw in him proof that change was possible, even for those who seemed beyond redemption. Yet the isolation was crushing. Trejo's criminal past made him unwelcome in many social circles, while his commitment to sobriety distanced him from the street life that had once provided identity and belonging. He existed in a liminal space between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The loneliness of this period would echo through his later years, even after fame arrived to complicate his life in new ways. His personal relationships suffered under the weight of his transformation. Marriage attempts failed as partners struggled to understand a man still learning to understand himself. Children came and went from his life as he wrestled with what it meant to be a father, when his own childhood had provided no positive role models. The emotional skills required for intimate relationships, trust, vulnerability, consistent presence, were luxuries his early life had never allowed him to develop. By his late 30s, Trejo had achieved sobriety and found meaningful work in addiction counseling, but he remained largely invisible to the wider world. The transformation from violent criminal to community advocate was complete, yet something essential was still missing: a sense of purpose, beyond mere survival, a way to channel his experiences into something larger than personal redemption. The story of how Danny Trejo became an actor reads like Hollywood fiction, too improbable to believe, yet documented by multiple witnesses and confirmed by the man himself. In 1985, while working as a drug counselor, Trejo was asked to help a young man struggling with cocaine addiction. That young man happened to be working on a film called Runaway Train, and when production assistants saw Trejo visiting the set, they were immediately struck by his authentic prison demeanor and distinctive appearance. Director Andrei Konchalovsky was looking for actors who could convincingly portray hardened criminals. Most Hollywood actors, no matter how talented, carried themselves with a confidence and optimism that read as false when playing desperate men. Trejo, by contrast, embodied authenticity born from lived experience. His very presence suggested violence held barely in check, pain transformed into strength, and a weariness that couldn't be taught in acting classes. His first role was small, a convict with a few lines and a memorable face. But something about Trejo's performance resonated with audiences and industry professionals alike. Here was an actor who didn't need to research his roles. He had lived them. The scars on his face weren't makeup effects, but genuine marks of a difficult life. The way he carried himself in prison scenes reflected muscle memory from years of actual incarceration. Word spread quickly through Hollywood's tight-knit community of casting directors and filmmakers. Producers looking for authentic villains began requesting that guy from Runaway Train, the ex-convict, who brought genuine menace to every scene. Trejo found himself in the surreal position of being cast repeatedly as the kind of criminal he had once been, using his painful past as raw material for a career he had never imagined possible. Yet success came with its own form of isolation. Trejo was welcomed in Hollywood as long as he remained safely contained within his established persona: the scary Mexican criminal, the intimidating gang member, the violent enforcer. Attempts to expand his range or explore different types of roles were met with resistance from an industry that preferred its reformed criminals to stay reformed but recognizable. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Danny Trejo appeared in dozens of films, becoming one of Hollywood's most prolific character actors. Movies like Heat, Con Air, Desperado, and Machete cemented his reputation as the go-to actor for roles requiring authentic menace. His distinctive appearance, the weathered face, prison tattoos, and thousand-yard stare made him instantly recognizable to audiences worldwide. But the success that should have brought satisfaction instead highlighted the limitations of his newfound fame. Trejo found himself trapped in a different kind of prison, one constructed not of concrete and steel, but of audience expectations and industry stereotypes. No matter how many films he appeared in or how much money he earned, he remained defined by his criminal past in ways that felt both empowering and diminishing. The roles themselves began to blur together. Villain after villain, criminal after criminal, each requiring him to access the same well of barely controlled violence. For a man who had spent decades learning to move beyond his past, the constant return to familiar patterns was emotionally exhausting. Trejo later admitted, "I spent years learning not to be that guy. Then Hollywood paid me millions to be that guy over and over again." The psychological toll was compounded by the disconnect between his public persona and private reality. Fans approached him expecting the menacing figure from their favorite action films, but the real Danny Trejo was a gentle man more likely to discuss addiction recovery than intimidate strangers. The constant performance required, maintaining the tough guy image that sustained his career, left him feeling increasingly disconnected from his authentic self. Personal relationships continued to suffer under the weight of fame and typecasting. Potential partners were either attracted to the dangerous image he projected on screen or intimidated by it. Neither response allowed for genuine connection with the man beneath the persona. His children struggled to reconcile the father they knew: patient, caring, deeply committed to helping others, with the violent characters he portrayed professionally. The release of Machete in 2010 marked the pinnacle of Danny Trejo's career and, paradoxically, the beginning of his most profound period of loneliness. Director Robert Rodriguez had crafted the film specifically as a vehicle for Trejo, finally giving him a leading role after decades of supporting parts. The character of Machete, a righteous ex-federale seeking revenge, allowed Trejo to play a hero while still drawing on his established tough guy persona. The film's success was overwhelming. At age 66, Trejo had become an action star, his face plastered on movie posters and merchandise worldwide. Suddenly, everyone wanted to work with him. Sequels were planned, endorsement deals materialized, and his name became synonymous with a particular brand of authentic cinematic violence. Yet the triumph felt hollow. Trejo had spent his entire life trying to escape the violence and criminality that defined his youth, only to find his greatest success came from embodying those very elements on screen. The irony was not lost on him. He had become famous for being the man he had spent decades trying not to be. Behind the scenes, those who worked with Trejo during this period noticed subtle changes. The affable, generous man who had been beloved by cast and crew members began to withdraw between takes. He remained professional and courteous, but the spark of genuine engagement seemed dimmed. Success had brought material comfort, but had also highlighted the essential loneliness of his position, celebrated for a persona that felt increasingly distant from his true self. The financial rewards were substantial, allowing Trejo to support his extended family and invest in various business ventures. Yet money could not address the deeper questions that began to haunt him. Had his life's journey from criminal to actor been genuine transformation or simply a more socially acceptable form of the same performance? Was he helping to perpetuate the very stereotypes about Mexican Americans and ex-convicts that had limited his own opportunities for authentic expression? As Danny Trejo entered his 70s, the complexities of his family relationships became increasingly apparent and painful. His 5 children, from multiple relationships, represented both his greatest source of pride and his deepest regret. Having grown up without positive male role models, Trejo struggled to navigate fatherhood, even as his career success provided material advantages his own childhood had lacked. His son, Danny Boy, who followed his father into the entertainment industry, became a particular source of worry. The younger Trejo's struggles with addiction mirrored his father's own journey, creating a painful cycle that fame and money seemed powerless to break. Watching his son wrestle with demons he recognized from his own past forced Trejo to confront the possibility that some damage transcends generations, that success in Hollywood couldn't necessarily heal wounds passed down through family lines. His daughter Danielle faced different but equally challenging issues as the child of a famous father, whose screen persona attracted both admiration and controversy. She struggled to establish her own identity separate from the Trejo name while dealing with the complications that came from having a parent whose most celebrated roles involved graphic violence and criminality. The geographic distance imposed by his career created additional strain. Film shoots took Trejo away from Los Angeles for months at a time, preventing the consistent presence that healthy family relationships require. Phone calls and visits couldn't substitute for the daily interactions that build trust and understanding between parents and children. Perhaps most painfully, Trejo's own transformation from criminal to respected community member remained incomprehensible to some family members who had known him during his darkest periods. The man who spoke eloquently about redemption and second chances at public events sometimes struggled to convince his own relatives that his change was genuine and permanent. Recognizing that his acting career couldn't last forever, Danny Trejo invested his earnings in various business ventures throughout the 2000s and 2010s. His restaurant chain, Trejo's Tacos, became a Los Angeles institution, serving authentic Mexican food while providing employment opportunities for others seeking second chances. The success of these ventures demonstrated his business acumen while allowing him to give back to the community that had shaped him. Yet even his entrepreneurial success carried emotional complications. The restaurant's popularity was inseparable from his celebrity persona. Customers came not just for the food but for the chance to eat at Machete's establishment. Once again, Trejo found himself performing a version of his public image, greeting fans, and maintaining the tough but friendly demeanor they expected. His other business interests, from barbershops to clothing lines, followed similar patterns. Each venture succeeded partly because of his fame, which meant he could never fully escape the identity that both empowered and confined him. The man who had spent decades learning to define himself beyond his criminal past now found his legitimate business success dependent on maintaining connections to that same past. The isolation of business ownership added another layer to his growing loneliness. Employees looked to him for leadership and stability, but few understood the personal costs of maintaining the public persona that made their jobs possible. Partners and investors saw dollar signs when they looked at Danny Trejo. They rarely saw the complex, troubled, deeply thoughtful man beneath the carefully maintained image. As Trejo entered his late 70s, the accumulated damage of his early life began to manifest in increasingly serious health problems. Decades of drug use, violence, and stress had taken their toll on a body that had already endured more punishment than most people experience in several lifetimes. The man who had survived gang wars and prison fights now faced enemies that couldn't be intimidated or negotiated with: arthritis, heart problems, and the gradual breakdown of a physique that had once seemed indestructible. The irony was bitter. Just as Trejo had achieved financial security and widespread recognition, his body began to betray him. Simple movements that had once been automatic, the quick reflexes that had kept him alive on the streets, the physical presence that commanded respect on movie sets, became labored and painful. Medical appointments became regular occurrences, interrupting the filming schedule that had provided structure and purpose to his later years. Directors who had once sought him out for his authentic portrayal of hardened criminals now had to work around his physical limitations, adjusting fight scenes and reducing the physical demands of his roles. The transition was particularly difficult because Trejo's identity had always been tied to his physical presence. The intimidating figure who could silence a room with a glance was gradually being replaced by an elderly man who needed assistance with tasks that had once been effortless. The vulnerability was real and unavoidable, yet it conflicted with the image that had sustained his career and self-concept for decades. Hospital stays, for procedures related to heart problems and other age-related conditions, provided unwanted time for reflection. Lying in bed, connected to machines that monitored his vital signs, Trejo confronted the reality that his body was failing in ways that willpower and determination couldn't overcome. The man who had conquered addiction and violence found himself powerless against the simple passage of time. In his 80s, Danny Trejo has increasingly turned his attention to mentoring young people facing challenges similar to those that once nearly destroyed him. His work with at-risk youth, ex-convicts, and addiction recovery programs has become the most meaningful aspect of his later years, more satisfying than any movie role or business success. Yet this work also highlights the persistent loneliness of his position. The young people he mentors respect and admire him, but the generational gap and the weight of his reputation create barriers to genuine friendship. He is their inspiration and guide, but rarely their equal or confidant. The very experiences that qualify him to help others also set him apart from them. His speaking engagements at prisons, schools, and recovery centers draw large audiences eager to hear from someone who has walked the path from desperation to success. But these events, while meaningful, are essentially performances, carefully crafted presentations of his life story designed to inspire rather than reveal. The deeper complexities, the ongoing struggles, the persistent sadness that shadows his success, these remain largely hidden from public view. The approach of mortality has added urgency to his mentoring work, but also deepened his sense of isolation. Trejo is acutely aware that his time is limited, that the lessons he has learned through decades of hard experience need to be passed on while he still can. Yet the very act of constantly sharing his story, sanitized and inspirational, prevents him from fully processing the emotional weight of his journey. At 81, Danny Trejo's romantic relationships reflect the complications of a life lived largely in public, but experienced mostly in private. His marriage history, including multiple divorces, tells the story of a man who learned too late how to be vulnerable with another person. The emotional skills required for intimate partnership were simply not part of his education during the formative years when such patterns are typically established. His current relationship status remains largely private, but friends describe a man who has grown increasingly cautious about opening his heart to romantic love. The fear of causing pain to others, or having his own painful past become a burden for someone else, has led to a pattern of emotional withdrawal that protects but also isolates. The women he has loved struggled to reconcile the gentle, thoughtful man they knew privately with the violent characters he portrayed professionally. Some were attracted to the danger his reputation implied, others were frightened by it. Neither response allowed for the kind of authentic connection that might have provided emotional sustenance during his later years. His relationships with his adult children have evolved into something more complex than traditional parent-child dynamics. They love and respect him but also carry their own wounds from growing up with a father whose attention was often divided between personal transformation and professional obligations. The success that was supposed to provide stability for his family also created new forms of distance and misunderstanding. Grandchildren provide some of the uncomplicated joy that has been rare in Trejo's adult relationships. They see him simply as a loving grandfather rather than as an actor, ex-convict, or public figure. Yet even these relationships are complicated by his health issues and the knowledge that time with them is limited. As Danny Trejo contemplates his 80th birthday, the contradictions of his life story have become impossible to ignore. He achieved more success than anyone, including himself, could have imagined when he walked out of San Quentin more than 5 decades ago. The scared, angry young criminal became a respected actor, successful businessman, and inspiration to countless people struggling with their own demons. Yet the very qualities that enabled his transformation, the ability to compartmentalize pain, the skill at performing different versions of himself, the determination to survive regardless of personal cost, also prevented him from experiencing the kind of deep, sustained happiness that might have made the journey feel complete. The houses are comfortable but often empty. The bank accounts are full but provide little emotional satisfaction. The fame brings recognition, but rarely understanding. The respect is genuine but sometimes feels unearned, based more on his ability to overcome his past than on who he has become in the present. In quiet moments, away from cameras and audiences, Trejo sometimes wonders what his life might have been like if he had found different paths to redemption. Would anonymous sobriety have been more satisfying than public success? Could he have been a better father, partner, friend, if he hadn't been performing for the world? These are not questions with easy answers, and Trejo has learned not to dwell on them for too long. The past cannot be changed. The present must be lived. The future remains uncertain. But the weight of these questions adds to the essential sadness that characterizes his later years. The sense that even extraordinary success cannot heal all wounds or fill all empty spaces. Perhaps the cruelest irony of Danny Trejo's later life is that his greatest triumph, transforming his painful experiences into a source of inspiration for others, requires him to constantly revisit the very trauma he has spent decades trying to heal. Every interview, every speaking engagement, every mentoring session demands that he return to the darkest chapters of his life, mining them for lessons and hope. The stories have been told so often that they have taken on the quality of performance pieces, carefully crafted, perfectly timed, designed for maximum impact. The raw pain that originally gave them power has been polished away through repetition, leaving narratives that inspire but also distance their teller from the authentic emotions they once contained. This creates a unique form of isolation, being surrounded by people who think they know your story while feeling that your true self remains essentially unknown. Trejo has become a character in his own life story, playing the role of the redeemed ex-convict with such skill that the performance has begun to obscure the person. The applause is genuine, the admiration is real, but the connection often feels superficial. People see what they need to see, proof that change is possible, evidence that second chances can lead to extraordinary outcomes. They rarely see the cost of transformation, or the ongoing struggles that success cannot eliminate. Today, Danny Trejo spends his quietest hours in his Los Angeles home, surrounded by mementos of a life that seems to belong to someone else. Movie posters featuring his menacing visage stare down from walls. Awards acknowledge achievements that feel simultaneously meaningful and hollow. The house is spacious enough for the large family gatherings he hosts, but often feels too big for the solitary man who inhabits it most days. His daily routine has slowed considerably. The morning workouts that once maintained his imposing physical presence have been replaced by gentler exercises designed to manage pain rather than build strength. Reading has become a primary activity, Biographies, mostly, stories of other people who overcame difficult circumstances to find meaning and purpose. The phone rings regularly with business calls, interview requests, and invitations to events. Trejo remains selective about his commitments, choosing those that align with his desire to help others while avoiding purely commercial endeavors that feel exploitative of his life story. Health appointments punctuate the week with unwelcome regularity. The man who once seemed indestructible now depends on medications and medical interventions to maintain basic comfort. The vulnerability is real and unavoidable, a stark reminder that even the most dramatic. As Danny Trejo contemplates his mortality, the question of legacy weighs heavily on his mind. Will he be remembered primarily as an actor who brought authenticity to countless villain roles? As an ex-convict who proved that redemption is possible? As a businessman who created opportunities for others seeking second chances? All of these identities contain truth, yet none feels complete. The real Danny Trejo, the man who has spent 8 decades learning how to be human, in a world that often seemed designed to prevent that possibility, remains largely hidden behind the various public personas that have sustained his career and enabled his service to others. The sadness in his story is not that he failed to overcome his circumstances, but that success came with costs he couldn't have anticipated when he was a young man desperate for any chance at a different life. The isolation, the constant performance, the inability to fully escape his past even in transformation, these were prices no one explained when he first began the long journey from San Quentin to Hollywood. Yet there is also profound beauty in his story, the proof that human beings possess almost infinite capacity for change, growth, and service to others. The young criminal who seemed destined for a life of violence and early death instead became a beacon of hope for countless people facing their own seemingly impossible circumstances. In the end, Danny Trejo's life represents both triumph and tragedy, the extraordinary achievement of someone who refused to be defined by his worst moments, shadowed by the persistent loneliness of a man who discovered that success and happiness are not synonymous. His scars tell stories of violence and redemption, but they also conceal the more subtle wounds that fame and time have inflicted. The boy who learned to fight before he learned to trust became a man who could inspire thousands but struggled to truly connect with the few people closest to him. As he sits now in his comfortable home, surrounded by evidence of a life lived far beyond its original expectations, Danny Trejo embodies a particularly American form of success, dramatic, visible, inspiring to observe from a distance. Yet those who love him most understand that the real victory was never the fame or money, but the simple fact that he survived to become someone capable of helping others survive as well. The applause will eventually fade, the movies will become historical artifacts, and the business empire will pass to others. What remains will be the lives he touched, the people he helped, and the proof he provided that even the most damaged among us can find ways to transform pain into purpose. Whether that legacy provides comfort in his final years remains to be seen. But for a man who began life with every possible disadvantage, who spent decades trapped in patterns of violence and self-destruction, the mere fact of reaching 81 with dignity intact and hope still alive represents a victory that transcends any Hollywood definition of success. The fire that once burned destructively within him now provides gentle warmth to others facing their own darkness. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps the sadness that shadows his later years is simply the natural cost of a life lived fully, completely, without reservation, first in service to destruction, then in service to redemption, always in service to the possibility that tomorrow can be different from yesterday.